Welcome back, everybody, to the High-Brix Cultivation System. Today is our final lesson, and it's on harvesting, preserving, and marketing your crops. So, in this lesson, we'll be covering how to harvest using no-till techniques. We'll talk about how to preserve your soil until the next growing season. Some of you may be growing immediately again, and some of you may actually be letting your soil rest for many months. So we'll talk about how to deal with that transition. We'll touch a little bit on this concept of flushing before harvest that is common among cannabis growers, and then we'll talk about some preservation techniques, and specifically for cannabis, really around drying and curing your product. And then finally, we'll touch on marketing your crop. If you are growing commercially or semi-commercially, we'll give you some tips on how to do that. Now, we'll just be touching on a lot of these subjects. We really could have an entire class on some of them, but they're a little bit outside the scope of this class, so just want to touch on them and get you thinking about these topics. Alright, so the last step in our process of growing High-Brix plants is, of course, harvesting them. And I want to talk specifically about the technique here because when you're using a no-till system, which as we know is really the best way that you're going to get High-Brix nutrient-dense plants, and especially over time that's going to be the case, you want to be very careful in how you harvest your plants. And it's going to be a little bit different than kind of the conventional wisdom about harvesting. So the main thing to understand here is that you are not pulling out the root base of your plants. You're actually just cutting off the plants as close to the soil as possible, but you're leaving the root system and the very base of the stem intact in the soil. Now, why would we do that? Well, just think back to everything we've learned about no-till and about organic material, preserving the soil and fungal networks. We don't want to disturb the soil digging down into it trying to pull out the roots. And some of our plants are going to have grown pretty massive root systems, so that would be really disruptive to the soil. Instead, when you cut off the plant and you just leave them there without something to grow from, that root system is going to start to decompose and break down, and it will just become more organic matter that can be consumed eventually by your worms and by other critters in the soil, by fungi and bacteria, and so it just becomes more organic matter food for the soil. And it's not going to harm your soil at all. Now, the important thing here is that we talked about many lessons ago about if you're growing in pots or raised beds, how much soil you want to have per plant. And we talked about if you're growing cannabis plants having at least 25 gallons. Now, this is part of the reason for that, is that you want to have enough space if you're going to start planting again immediately and the root system hasn't fully decomposed yet. You want to have enough space to be able to plant right next to the old root system. If you're growing in, say, a 3 or a 5 gallon pot, that root system is probably going to have taken over and consumed pretty much all of the soil that's in your pot. So as we know, it does require a bit more of an investment up front. It requires using more soil overall, but the benefits are going to be reaped long term as that soil continues to improve. And in fact, as it gets more biologically active, that root system will break down more rapidly, and it's just going to contribute to the overall fertility of your soil. So that's the idea behind no-till harvesting. You want to cut off the stem at the top, leave the root system there, and plant again next to the old root system. And then the second piece of this process is once you have harvested everything that you want from the plant, so whether it's the flowers, or it's the fruits, or it's pods, or whatever it is, you can leave the rest of the plant on top of your soil as mulch. So if you've got leaves, you've got stems left over, you spread that on top of the soil, let it mulch in. Again, just another way to provide organic matter to the soil. You can also take that out and compost it separately, but make sure that you're using that organic material in some way because that's valuable. You don't want to throw it away. And then once you've harvested and you've either mulched or you've composted the remainder of the plant, now it's time to make sure that your soil holds over until the next time you're going to plant. So again, some of you may be planting in your soil immediately and growing all year round, and that's great. In that case, you're also going to probably need to add more organic matter to that soil because it's going to get depleted more quickly. But if you are growing outside in a climate where you can't grow in the winter and you're allowing your soil to overwinter, you want to make sure that that soil stays alive. This is really the key. So what is the key to making that soil stay alive? It's to make sure that a living root system continues to be in that soil. And so this is where cover crop becomes really vital. You should definitely be growing a cover crop while your soil is resting. It really shouldn't take much effort, but the main thing you'll need to do is continue watering it so that that crop continues to grow and doesn't die off. And occasionally you'll want to come in, and if it's getting really tall or too tall, just trim it down and leave it on the top and let it mulch. A lot of cover crops will just, depending on when you trim them, they will just bounce back of their own accord, but you can also reseed that cover crop too. If you're growing in pots and you're growing outside and you live in a place that freezes, some people have an instinct that they want to take their soil indoors in order to protect it from the harsh winters. But remember, soil that's in the ground is outdoors all year round and it gets by, and if that's your natural climate, then leave your potted soil outdoors and let it hibernate through the winter. Don't worry about your earthworms and your other critters and your microbes. They will be okay. They've evolved to survive freezing temperatures. In fact, worms have a way of hibernating, and if it's too cold for them to hibernate, they will lay eggs, which are protected by a sort of cocoon that protects them from freezing temperatures so that they can hatch again in the spring. So there's no need to bring your soil indoors, but if you are keeping it outdoors and you are in a climate that doesn't freeze, you'll want to continue feeding organic material to your soil so that those worms and other critters have something to eat and to decompose. Now, if you really don't want to spend much time on this and have to worry about it, this is where having an automatic irrigation system can really come in handy. So hooking up something like a blue mat that will ensure the soil stays moist and gets the water it needs. Or you may be in a climate where it rains a lot through the winter, and in that case you can just leave it outside and let it get rained on. So just to touch quickly on this concept of flushing. Now this is a very common practice with cannabis growers. There's this idea that if you've been using salt-based nutrients, you need to flush those out of the soil a week before harvest in order to make sure that the cannabis has a good flavor. And the idea is it's going to have kind of a more harsh or chemically flavor if you don't do this flushing action. Now, honestly, there are some people that question whether this is true. Personally, I kind of question whether it's true. You know, this nutrients is in the soil at that point and not necessarily in the plant. So it's hard to say if the plant is going to, uptake those nutrients and have that chemical flavor in the last week. Maybe it does, but regardless, since we are growing with living soil, we're not adding salt-based nutrients, we don't really even have to worry about this. So if you're growing with living soil, there's no need to flush anything out of the soil, even if you are feeding the soil and feeding the plant in the very last week and feeding it compost or ferments or whatever you're feeding it, there's no need to flush. None of those amendments are going to negatively affect the flavor. Alright, so now we get on to preserving your harvest, preserving your crop. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't think about because they're so caught up in growing, and especially if they're growing for the first time, they're learning so much about growing and paying attention to so much that they may not necessarily think ahead and plan for what they're going to do with their crop after harvest. But this, unfortunately, is a big mistake that a lot of people make. You really want to make sure you've got a plan ahead of time for how you're going to preserve your crop after you've harvested. Unless you just have a really small garden bed that you're growing at home and you're going to pretty much immediately consume whatever you're growing, then of course you don't have to worry about that. But a lot of people will have a bigger garden. Maybe you want to have some nice garden food through the winter, or you want to have cannabis all year round. And if you've grown cannabis before, you know you need to have a way to cure and dry and preserve that. And unfortunately, these past 2 years as hemp was legalized nationwide, a lot of farmers jumped into growing hemp and didn't have a plan for what to do with their crop at the end, and all of a sudden it was harvest time and they had thousands of pounds of harvested plant and they didn't have anywhere to dry and cure it and prepare it, and they lost a lot of their crop. So make sure you're not that person. Make sure you have a plan in place for what you're going to do after you harvest, because preserving can actually be half the battle, believe it or not. Even though you have all these challenges in growing, if you don't have a way to preserve, then you can lose a lot of your crop. So the main methods for preserving typically include drying, salting, and fermenting. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth specifically about drying as it applies to cannabis, but you can dry fruits as well. You can salt vegetables, meats, and you can ferment or pickle vegetables. All right, so the first part of drying and preserving your cannabis is trimming. So there's kind of this big debate about whether you should wet or dry trim, and a lot of people have strong opinions about this. Personally, I have only done dry trimming, but from what I can tell, it really seems to depend on your circumstance whether you want to wet or dry trim. And there's some advantages and disadvantages to each, so I wouldn't necessarily immediately rule one out just because someone has told you absolutely wet trim or absolutely dry trim. And it's especially important to consider your climate, because actually, if you're in a rather humid climate, over 50% humidity, you may want to consider wet trimming, because otherwise it's easy for your buds to get too wet, to stay too wet, and to risk molding. So that's really a lot of what we're trying to prevent here is the bud from molding. If you're in a lower humidity climate, on the other hand, below 50% humidity, then dry trimming could be for you, because you don't have to worry as much about that, and you can leave the entire plant intact when you're drying it. So some advantages of wet trimming is that if you've trimmed off all those leaves, that's what wet trimming means, and then you're letting mostly just the bud dry, it is going to dry a lot faster because you don't have to those leaves aren't there blocking the moisture from getting out. And in that regard, it is also more space efficient, because now you've trimmed off the fan leaves, you've trimmed off a lot of the other leaves, and you can pack the buds a little bit more densely together as they're drying. However, some advantages of dry trimming are that the bud's going to be a lot less sticky, so it is less messy when you get to trimming. And a lot of people prefer the look of the dry trim because you're just going to get more dense buds. But again, to be honest, I would say really the most important consideration is probably your climate, and then on top of that, how much space you have available for trimming and drying. Okay, now whether you decide to wet or dry trim, possibly the first step in the process or the second step is going to be the drying. So drying is typically done by hanging your plants upside down. Some people put them on racks, but you're typically going to need to account for about a week to do the drying step. And the real way that you know whether or not the bud has dried all the way is by testing the stems, trying to break them, and if they actually snap, then that means that they're dry enough. If they just bend, then that means it's still a little bit too wet. Now the stem doesn't have to break all the way off, it just needs to snap like a dry branch. And that's when you know that they're dry enough to now finish up the trimming process if you haven't yet, and then start curing. And curing is a really important process that is sometimes underestimated, but this is often the difference between a really high quality craft cannabis and something of a more mediocre quality. So we've just learned how to grow really high quality, high terpene, high brix plants. I think we probably want to make sure that our curing practices kind of match with that in terms of the standards and the quality, because if you're taking this course, you probably want to get really high quality. Now along those lines, I highly recommend curing in glass jars. Some people like to do it in paper bags, some people in plastic bags. The problem with paper is that it's breathable, and so it actually kind of defeats the purpose of what you're trying to do with curing, which is keep the air out for a period of time. And plastic, even though it's more airtight, plastic is just more likely to somehow, maybe just subtly affect the flavor, because plastic compounds can leach out of plastic containers, and so you just want to make sure you're not going to have that problem. Use glass. Glass is a very durable, stable material that's not going to affect your buds negatively. And people may think this is more expensive, but it's really not that cost prohibitive. You can get these 16-ounce ball jars, which is what I use, for less than $10 for 12 or 16 packs of them. So, and one of these 16-ounce ball jars can hold about half an ounce. So if you've got a whole pound, you're going to need about 32 of these ball jars, but again, you can buy them for typically less than $1 a piece, so not going to be that expensive. The next part is that you're going to be burping them every 24 hours or so. So that means just simply opening up the top and allowing fresh air to get in, allowing the built up moisture to escape from the jar. And you're going to want to do this every day for at least 2 weeks, if not 4 weeks or even longer, to really get the best effect. Now, this does get a little tedious. It's a little bit of extra work, if you got 30 ball jars that you got to open up, burp them, close them out again. But in the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't take that much time. Maybe 20 minutes each day. You just schedule it into your day to do it, and it's really going to give you much higher quality in the end. So I would highly recommend preserving your cannabis that way. That's the way that I do it, and man, it has the smoothest smoke, and I think it really allows me to preserve that good quality. All right, and the last piece here, we're just going to touch a little bit on ways to market your harvest. If you are trying to be commercial or aspiring towards being commercial. Now, a lot of you know that farmers markets are a great way for farmers and growers to market directly to consumers. The only problem is that even though there's so many farmers markets out there, a lot of the good ones often have a long wait time to get into them. I know, because I've tried to sign up for a farmer's market booth and was told that there was a long wait list and it was booked to capacity, and honestly probably would be years before I got in there. So unfortunately that is just the case with a lot of farmers markets. You could try to start your own. They are growing in popularity, so you might have some success with that, but I wouldn't rely solely on farmers markets. Another thing you can do is start a CSA, or Community Supported Agriculture. And this is just simply the idea that you get a number of members to buy into your small farm and to pay you monthly for your harvest, and to pay you ahead of time so that you can get some money in your pocket, and then you just have an obligation to deliver to them on a regular basis. So the nice thing about this is that you kind of get a lot more bang for your marketing buck, because you get one customer and ideally they're going to stay with you for a long time, so you don't have to continue selling over and over to different customers every time you harvest. Another strategy is if you have a beautiful, picturesque farm that you can invite people to. Agro-tourism is growing in popularity and is a great option if you can come up with reasons for people to want to come and tour your farm. If you can create different attractions for them, like cooking food, serving dinners, even creating a little restaurant on the property, having places to spend the night, or hosting events there that will draw people in. There's many different creative things you can do to draw people to come to your farm, and they can purchase things at the farm, or they will just simply know your name and be more familiar and more likely to buy your produce. Of course, even with CSAs and with agro-tourism, you still have to get the word out somehow, and you have to still draw people to come and sign up for your CSA or come to the agro-tourism. So, how do you do that? Word of mouth obviously is a great way to get started. If you have a big social network, you can get started that way. But a lot of people, a lot of farmers these days rely on social media, especially Facebook and Instagram, where they can post pictures and they can draw on a much larger social circle to know more about their farm and ultimately buy products from their farm. So here are just some quick tips for social media marketing. These are the practices that I've been using myself for Everflux and for my own personal profile. And these are really, I would say, some of the best practices that I've learned from other social media marketing experts. So one of the key things is consistency. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to hear that because you're probably so busy growing that you don't want to be spending time on social media every day. But your growing that you do every day can be a great source of content for your social media, especially for stories, which are really easy to post real quickly. Just share with people what you're doing, exactly what you're doing that day. And if you can spend a little bit more time, 10-15 minutes, coming up with a great post each day or every couple of days, that's great. When you're posting, make sure that the content is diverse. So one expert has recommended picking 5 categories of areas that you want to post about. And have these be things that you really care about in your personal life. So one category could be your garden, but pick a couple other categories of things that you really care about, just to diversify the content a bit, so it's not all pictures of your garden. But you want to make sure that it is something that's going to be interesting to your audience. So try to add humor, try to add educational posts. And when you're posting, it's really helpful to use hashtags, especially more common hashtags, and to tag people that you want to see your posts. And the people you're going to want to tag are these people that I would call your Dream 100, which could be clients that you want to get. If your goal is to sell to a restaurant or sell to a dispensary, you should be following that restaurant or dispensary and tagging them when appropriate and commenting on their posts and liking their posts. And your Dream 100 could also be people that you want to have collaborations with. Maybe there's an influential blogger or podcaster that you want to be invited on their blog or their podcast. So you should be following them and interacting with them. And try to do the interactions just as often as you do your own posts. Schedule some time daily. Doesn't even have to be a long time. 30 minutes, maybe an hour max to do all this stuff. And eventually what you're going to want to work towards is doing some marketing collaborations with other Instagram accounts where you guys are posting about each other and what you're doing, and it just helps to expand both of your audiences. All right, so we have come to the end of our course. Now I want to just address here what is next. So first of all, I just want to say, keep at it, don't get discouraged. If this is your first time growing with these kind of methods, with living soil, regenerative, no-till, it can seem a little bit overwhelming and complicated at first, but just don't overcomplicate it. That's probably the most important message. A lot of people try to overcomplicate, especially with the different amendments and inputs that they're using. Just really try to simplify things, and you will find that this method of growing with nature actually is rather simple once you kind of wrap your head around it. So if something goes wrong, don't get discouraged, don't blame it on the system, just continue revising what you're doing and keep at it. So also remember that for this particular course, you can get a certificate of completion, which you can use to show employers or whoever else you want that you have a credential in this way of growing. And we are actually working on getting continuing education credits for this course. So in order to complete the course and get the certificate, you've got to take the quizzes. There's 2 quizzes, one on the first half of the course and one at the end of the course. You just got to get 70% in order to pass and get your certificate of completion. But if you score 90% or higher, you can actually qualify to become a teacher or a trainer of this course and teach it to other people. And we will basically give you the curriculum for that and support you in that. And in addition, you can also become a distributor for Everflux. If you want to sell our products as part of teaching this course, we will give you the resources you need in order to do that. There's also opportunities to become an affiliate with us. If you got value out of this course and out of our products and you want to send people back to us, then we will pay you a small commission for sending people our way. So please get in touch with us, info@everflux.tech, if you're interested in the teaching opportunities or the affiliate opportunities. And you can also follow me personally at PermaVanDan, and you can follow Everflux at Everflux, both on Instagram. So again, thank you so much for taking this course, for putting your trust in nature and in the system, and we'll see you out there growing.